Let's look at H2S character in beer. H2S, or hydrogen sulphide. A sulfur compound which has a very potent smell. This is a flavour which in very low levels helps create the impression of the beer being fresh. But when the level is too high, it makes the beer seem odd and unusual, and as if there is something wrong with it. Now, at low levels, it reminds people of the smell of boiled eggs, freshly boiled eggs, because egg yolks give off H2S. But at high level, it reminds people of a bad egg, an egg which is spoiled. And at high level, it's a very undesirable flavour. Now, many beers contain low levels of H2S, and those blend into the flavour of the beer, giving you a positive flavour characteristic. But in some beers, the level can be too high, making the beer sulphury or sulfidic, as it's sometimes called. The origin of the H2S is the yeast strain used to make the beer. During fermentation, yeast produces H2S from inorganic sulfate in the wort. It does that by its normal metabolic reactions. And that H2S can either be flushed off in the fermenter, being lost with the CO2, or it can remain in the beer. If too much of it remains, then you'll get a beer that smells of boiled eggs or smells of H2S. Now, this is a flavour that when you're detecting it, you have to be very careful in how you assess. If I was to take a deep sniff of this beer, I'll blind myself to H2S. In the same way as if I looked at the sun, I would be blinded temporarily for a short time. So this is a flavour you have to be very careful not to become overexposed to. The best way to do this is to use the drive-by technique. Simply move the beer past your nose, and you're looking for this boiled egg characteristic. That technique avoids you getting overexposed. You can also move the beer away from your nose while you're smelling. It's a flavour that when you taste the beer, like this, you'll find no H2S characteristics in your mouth. It's simply an odour, not a flavour. As I mentioned, for some beers, this is an off flavour, but an off flavour which can be controlled. Some brewers will dose in low levels of copper into their beer, either by their choice of equipment, for example, a copper brewhouse or copper kettle, or by the use of a copper electrode to add tiny amounts of copper ions to trap the H2S and remove it from the beer. But generally it's best to avoid the H2S forming in the first place by keeping a healthy yeast strain and by keeping a vigorous fermentation. In some circumstances, the H2S can be caused by bacterial contamination, particularly in traditional English ales, where a bacterium called Zymomonas can produce a lot of H2S. Thankfully, that problem is very uncommon nowadays, because Zymomonas can only grow when you've added glucose to the beer as a priming sugar. There are some styles of beer though where H2S is an important part of the flavour. For example, traditional Burton Pale Ales from England have a lot of H2S. It's sometimes called the Burton Snatch or Burton Stench. This flavour is because the Burton water used to make the beer contains a lot of sulphate, and the yeast strains used to make that type of beer are very effective at converting the sulphate to H2S. This flavour can be confused by tasters for other sulphur compounds like mercaptans, but by training alongside with the H2S and the mercaptan, the chance of the confusion is very small. The most common failure of tasters to detect this is because they come overexposed. But if you're careful to move the glass away or move it just past your nose like this while assessing the beer, you won't have that problem. H2S, positive freshness, off flavour and high level, an important flavour to identify.